Hello. For my next foray into the thin air literary canon, I've read Left for Dead, My Journey Home from Everest by Beck and Stephen G. Michaud, and also just about anyone else they could interview. There's lots of transcripts in here from people they talked to, like people on the mountain, mostly people off the mountain, lots of family, friends. It was a wide array of perspectives, and I didn't really read any reviews before going into this. I try not to. I just want to like read the book and see what I get from just that. But on my library website, you can see reviews that people can leave directly on the platform. It seemed that most people who went to review this book on the Hennepin County libraries and stuff said that it's not as exciting as Into Thin Air, so you should just read that, which if you want something exciting, maybe, I don't know, I feel like it wasn't that exciting. You could like read a novel that's more exciting to get excitement. There's other anyway, tangent again. I didn't love Into Thin Air, to put it mildly, but essentially the consensus was too much Beck, not enough Weathers. They thought this was too self-indulgent on his family background, like that sort of stuff, and it was less so about Everest. And this was not very much about Everest per se. The first part of this book was about his time on Everest, and there's 4 parts. So yeah, and this is the only book I've read so far. I forget about maybe some of the children's book that didn't even have a map. That just shows kind of how untechnical that this book is, but I enjoyed that, actually. Yes, you still get like his perspective on Everest there, but in the subsequent parts you get more insight into aspects that go relatively unexplored in the other books, such as why anyone would do this, and what it's like for their families, especially when their families are not also mountaineers and would actually prefer that you weren't a mountaineer and that you especially didn't climb Mount Everest. I had a lot of fun with this book. I thought Beck was very funny. I thought Peach, his wife, who is probably the most prominent voice in here besides his own, I think she gets the most space, is iconic. Every time she was just dropping bars, I'm obsessed with her. Also, this book does kind of seem to exist to be a leg of his public speaking, motivational speaking endeavors that came about after Everest. So sometimes you'd be reading and it'd say something about like, oh yes, I pushed through there. We all need to push through something. You need an anchor. For me, my anchor was my family, but for you, it could be your colleagues. He also said your friends or God, but the fact that he lists colleagues as like something that grounds you and like pushes you forward to do intense things, he definitely gives some speeches to corporate audiences, which was said in his author bio. I thought that was very silly. I thought this book overall was extremely silly. Beck is a total jokester, and also just, this was not necessarily written. In the first chapter, I thought the writing was like really bad. It seemed like very simple, and then sometimes there would be like a really overly written like SAT word, and I was like, oh no. But then there'd be a couple jokes here and there. Then it got more funny as we went on. I thought this was extremely fun, and I love to read funny books, which so it's nice to get a reprieve from like, oh, bleak mountaineering, everything's awful and people died. Even though the first part of the book is about Everest and there's other parts, I feel like he spent enough time on it. He didn't like overstay that welcome, and also showed a lot of restraint. If it were me, I would have been like, and then this person left me for dead, and then that person left me for dead, and I would have spent the whole book complaining about being left for dead, and oh yeah, they didn't believe in me, and yeah, they left me to die, yeah, and then they said I was dead, but I wasn't dead. To be fair, like, I know how the mountains work and like mountaineering culture, and it was an emergency, and it's once you kind of enter that state on the mountains, almost no one comes back from that, especially not in the sense that like they can live like a month after, 2 months, a year, years. Yeah, I understand why he was left, and so did he. But I would have milked it for all it's worth. But I guess that says more about me. Anyway, so yeah, the first section of the book is about his time on Everest. We get into some more of the antics that go on up there, especially like in base camp, like the times before the summit push. It seems like they were just guys being dudes, joshing around, making jokes about, oh, this guy, he's totally in love with this yak named Buttercup, and every yak they passed would be Buttercup, and they'd be like, he took it like a champ. And he was such a jokester as well. One time he left his tent and he was wearing a sombrero. Isn't that the silliest thing? And it's like, okay, it was in the 90s. Like, some things where it's just like, okay, I don't know, that's just not inherently funny anymore. But you know, they were having a good time, especially for downtime in base camp, and when you're like go out and you do a little acclimation hike and then you need to go back and rest and things like that. You need stuff, or you don't need stuff, but you would like stuff to keep you busy. And Beck's like, I brought a novel by one of my favorite authors, and then I also brought a juggling kit because I thought I would like to juggle. The irony was not lost on him. He's very willing to be like, yeah, that's funny, which yeah, that is funny. I'm sorry. You know, there's just some stuff where it's like, oh yeah, he was a Republican man in 1990s writing this, or 1990s living this, and probably writing this. This came out in 2000. So I don't want to like nitpick and be like, oh, but yeah, there's some parts where I was like reading and I was giggling, kicking my feet, having a grand old time. And he said, we looked ridiculous in those tents. We looked like a bunch of homeless. Isn't that so silly? And I'm like, oh yes, that's so silly, Beck. Yes, you know how the homeless spend $65,000 in 1990s US currency for the opportunity to live in tents. Oh my gosh, so fun. So yeah, it was fun to see like a more like social fun side of base camp, especially he was a client, he wasn't doing any work at all. Coward, like you could argue, was doing journalism. Anatoly was guiding, porting, like setting things up. And Beck was just there to climb and have fun and hopefully summit. He was very into the 7 summits idea that Dick Bass popularized, and then other people did. So yeah, he seemed very driven by that because he is very accomplishment based. He is like, oh, I need something to do this to prove that, oh, I have this accolade, and impress people and have something to live for, because he was extremely depressed. It's in here a lot, his depression. It's maybe less so talked about what he does to address it, if anything, but it is really explored how it impacts him and his family, because he would just kind of throw himself into these hobbies and leave them on the back burner. It would just be work and whatever he wanted to do. There's some stuff in there later. Peach, she is a saint. Oh yeah, one of the things that he talks about in that first section is his boots. In Into Thin Air, John Krakauer was like losing his mind over how some of his fellow clients on that team had new boots that weren't totally broken in, and he's like, that's a nightmare. And then Beck's, he was not having a good break-in period, but Beck addresses that and he's like, in my experience, boots are boots. They should fit. But it was his second pair of boots, and his first one he'd been wearing for like 7 years and wore holes in. So he's like, I needed a new pair. And he was like, they were allegedly the same make and the same model from the same factory and the same size, but they just were shredding up my feet. Yeah, I think it probably would have been smarter to test them out before the mountain, try and break them in more. It was like, what are you gonna do if your boots are already broken, like holes in the sole, and you need new shoes? I guess you could like line it up better. With running, you're supposed to like have 2 pairs going. Anyway, I digress, but he does address the boot controversy from his perspective. Otherwise, he's very deferential to John Krakauer. It's like he wrote the definitive thing. He does say here in this book that John did offer to help him. I wasn't able to easily see that interview referenced in the afterword of the climb where Beck said that he was asking John to lead him down, and John was like, Beck, I'm not a guide, ew. But I don't know, it seems like everyone has different accounts because, again, it was altitude, hypoxia, everything, crisis, disaster, literal no air. But he does kind of come for Anatoly a little bit later, which I don't love because I love Anatoly. Parrots what John says, like, oh, like, he was in the climb only for himself. He wasn't there to help the clients or do his job, and he was just chilling in camp, and he went out to rescue those people, but that's only because he would have been, like, torn apart by the climbing community had he not. He does eventually say, yeah, he saved lives, and that's how he should be remembered, and also he died before the writing of this book, so rip. But then it just seems like, again, I've only read 3 books so far about like from firsthand survivors of the disaster, so there's not too much to go on, but it does seem like the adventure clients so far love to talk on Anatoly and what they think his intentions must have been and what they think those plans must have been when they were clients. That's not their team. It seems like they want to have someone to kind of blame for some of how this all went down. And then, of course, because they were on Rob Hall's team and he seemed like a really chill, cool guy, they're like, well, Rob Hall is a saint and a martyr, rip. Which, yes, very sad. But it seems like all of the adventure consultants people are so willing to want to speculate on Anatoly's motives and come for him for giving a few inconsistent accounts of what happened, but especially when there is a language gap, you know, like, I think it's very possible he was just, like, not able to articulate what he wanted as well as he could, and then things got published without necessarily getting what he wanted to say out. Like, everyone here has been giving inconsistent accounts. Like, John swore up and down he saw Andy Harris when he didn't, and then retracted that. And then that article I can't find. Beck said that John Krakauer refused to guide him, but then he said that he offered. I don't know. They're like, oh my god, Anatoly gave an inconsistent account. How could he do that? This is all his fault. When they're also giving inconsistent accounts. Anyway, and then also really speculating on, like, Anatoly and Scott Fisher's motivations, and not so doing that for Rob Hall, except to just say that, oh, he was a hero, he was a G, which, yes, rip, but they're like, oh, Anatoly only rescued those people because he knew it would be a horrible look if he was in the tents and he didn't go out to save them. And when Rob was told, hey, Doug is a goner, you need to descend now to save yourself, and he said, no, I'm not leaving him. And they're like, yeah, that's so sweet, what a hero. I don't think this is fair, I don't think this is just, but I feel like there's more grounds to make this accusation against him than Anatoly, for being selfish or for being concerned about his image and making decisions based on that, because how would it have looked if he, as at that time the premier Everest guide, abandoned a client to die to save himself? They're like, oh, he couldn't do that because he couldn't stand to look at himself in the mirror afterwards if that were to happen, which probably that too. But then Andy Harris tried to go back up to help him and Doug, and then also died. And then it's just kind of like, great, now there's at least 2 more guys who maybe could have lived, and then they didn't. And they had partners and families, and yeah, again, Rob had the daughter on the way. So it's like, that's something I grapple with a lot. Again, my opinion doesn't matter. I wasn't born yet, I wasn't there. Like, but it's just, is it more heroic to die because you don't want to abandon someone, or you're trying to save people in really dire straits when you're in dire straits yourself? Or is it more heroic to try and make sure you live and can be there for your loved ones who aren't there? Yeah, anyway, Beck loves to be a little silly. He loves a joke. At one point later in the book, when he talks about training for Everest, he said he was on a seafood diet. He sees food and he eats it. And then he also was seeing a personal trainer because he was like wrecking himself trying to train for this stuff. He was like, I went to the gym so many hours a week. I was training harder than anyone could, and yet like I was always in pain. I couldn't sleep on my left side, my right side, because my arms were so fucked up. And then his wife was like, I saw a personal trainer because my doctor was concerned about my bone density from osteoporosis, and I think you might like to see the personal trainer. And Beck was like, oh, that's for sissies, that's for bored housewives. But Peach was like, no, seriously. And then he's like, okay, fine. And so she needs to make the appointments, and he goes to see the personal trainer, who's like, wow, your form is terrible. You're just trying to lift as heavy as you can with no form, and that's why you're tearing yourself apart and you can't make progress and you're in pain constantly. And he was like, he was interviewed and he was like, yeah, Beck was very determined. He is a great client, but yeah, it was a lot of what we were doing was trying to show him that you can get more done in 3 hours with a plan and proper form than you can in like 18 hours just lifting as heavy. Beck is very much the type of person where he'd rather do it himself. And this book is kind of about his journey, not only home from Everest, but learning to need to depend on people, because he had to literally depend on people after Everest with his hands. Even before they were amputated, like when they were just frostbitten, he couldn't really use them for things, important things. He, once he got off the mountain and into a hotel, he was like, I went to a nice hotel, and they stationed a young man outside my door because they knew of my situation, so that if I needed to go to the bathroom, and he was there to wipe my fanny, because, you know, that's how Beck writes. It's so fun, Fanny. And he's like, then I would have not eaten for 2 weeks to avoid that. And good thing that's basically what I was doing with the mountain. So he didn't need to employ that young man's services, because by the time he needed his fanny wiped again, his little brother had made it. So he's like, it wasn't my favorite, but I'd rather it be family. I guess let's talk about him getting off the mountain. It was the highest altitude rescue mission at that point. I haven't looked if anything more dramatic has happened since, but like it was pretty high up. It was higher than base camp for sure. I think maybe even higher than camp 1 or 2. It was below the Lhotse face, but definitely above the ice fall. Again, there's no map. Also, there's just so many words I can't reference everything. But it was extremely high up. It was higher altitude than any rescue mission. Planes aren't necessarily rated to fly up nearly that high. It's basically impossible. But Peach didn't know that, and she was in Dallas, and basically she got word that her husband was dead. So then she had to go tell everyone, like their children, family, friends, Beck's dead. But then they're like, wait, he walked himself back to camp? He's still alive? They're like, his state's not great. They're like, they wanted to prepare her to be like, yeah, he's probably still gonna die though here. I mean, everyone's going to die. But she was just kind of like in it. She's like, I'm locking in. I'm gonna do what needs to be done. And she wasn't even at this point very thrilled with him. She was like, I decided once you get back from Everest, I was going to divorce you. But she's like, he's still alive. Let's mobilize. So she and all her Dallas mom friends start calling everyone, lobbying, including politicians. So yeah, they lobby politicians. I'm gonna get to that process later because I'm on the page now of the pilot who did it. Lieutenant Colonel Madan KC. He was just golfing, chilling, but then embassies were getting called, and they were trying to find a pilot who would take this. They're like, this is an impossible thing. One of the ambassadors was like, I know a guy. He has a brave heart, he thinks, but he hasn't had a proper opportunity to test it. So he's just chilling, golfing, and he gets a call. The ambassador, she asks him, like, will you do this like wild, impossible, highly dangerous mission. And he's like, yeah. And he does it. And then the leader of the Taiwanese expedition, I'm blanking on his real name at the moment, but he goes by Michaud. Nicknames were big in this book, more on that later. He was also rescued like the morning after, and his feet were frostbitten. So like Beck's hands, that's like very bad to have on the mountain, but like Makalu having frostbitten feet is far worse. They send the helicopter rescue. He somehow manages to do it, and they're like, he's like, I can only take one passenger. Like that's how much like space and weight or clearance was in there. Beck here says that he said he should go instead of me because of his feet, and also just because he didn't want to like need to second guess that. He was like, yeah, he can go, which is different from Into Thin Air because John Krakauer wrote it that everyone else decided that for Beck, and then John Krakauer had to humbly tell him that you're actually not getting the plane that was sent for you. And then he did say that Beck took it like a champ, but you know, some differences there. It's always, you know, who's telling the story. So the pilot, Madame, he drops off Makalu, and then he's like, I was sent for Beck, so I'm gonna go back and get Beck. And he's like, we had 7 minutes of fuel left, but I did it. And so he does, nails it, and saves Beck. And yeah, they're very thankful for him. But getting that plane, it was sent for Beck because of the mobilization of the, as they're referred to in this book, the Dallas Tiger Moms. So they're calling up all the politicians they know, and they're kind of the upper echelon of Dallas society, shall we put it, like, you know, wealthy doctors and other well-connected people. So they're like, so we called up our good friend George on his private line, George W. Bush, the governor, and his daughter Jenna picked up and said that he was on a jog. And we said, oh, this is a matter of utmost importance, Jenna. Tell your father to call us back right away. And so he does. This is from a quote from one of their friends, the Weathers friends, Linda Gravel. She's like, so yeah, we called up George Bush on his private line and explained that we needed to get rescue. And then George W. Bush said, well, that's a matter of national things. There's nothing I can do. Bye. And Linda was like, I cannot believe you. This is someone you know, and you won't even help me. He said, I just can't do anything. I don't know what to tell you. And then Linda said, I was pretty mad. We've seen him since, and the subject does not come up. Oh yeah, I was giggling. And then somebody said, we need to get a Democrat involved in this. They're all very mainly right-wing at that household summit. Cappy and Janie McGarr are like their two Democrat friends in the circle. So, and they knew Tom Daschle, the minority leader in the Senate. And then they also got Kay Bailey Hutchinson, or the junior Republican senator from Texas, who several of us knew. So it was through the senators that they were able to get in contact with the embassy in Kathmandu and somehow send a plane to do the impossible. I thought that was so funny about George W. Bush. I was living out so hard. I understand that the governor can't necessarily do things on this scale, but instead of being like, here's who you should call, he just said, oh, I don't know what to say. Bye. So yeah, that was one of many times I had a good giggle in this book. It was really fun, which I wasn't expecting about this book about a man being left for dead and then like his getting like the worst frostbite. Such bad frostbite. But yeah, then there's a lot of stuff where he was home and they were glad that he was home and alive. Peach was very much like, I felt like if he'd cared about me and the children, he wouldn't have done this in the first place. And later she said something like, it was never verbally spoken, but there was a lot of tacit, I told you so. She's so real for that. Then part 1 ends, he's home. He's like, I want to fix my relationship with my family. And then the final part of part 1, it's teased like, suffice it to say that when the shadow of a second life and death crisis suddenly fell over the Weathers household that summer, it was my time to give back so much that I'd stolen away. So he's gonna step up in another life or death crisis in the household. I know you're probably thinking, when are we gonna get word on that? We're this far into the book with this much left in the book. Probably, I would say, it might have been about here. We're in suspense for here, which I didn't love. I was like, structurally, this is a nightmare. Also, there's a part where they get into the lore of all of the family pets. It's really funny. I was like, is a life or death crisis gonna be like the dog? Like, yeah, that's sad, but crisis? But it was a family member, a human. Once it got to that point, I kind of appreciated that they didn't earmark him for death earlier. It didn't like impact all of my reading about him up to that point. And then it was like extra impactful because I was like, oh, not him. So yeah, then we start with Beck's family. His given name was Seaborn Beck Weathers. He just goes by Beck, which was like his mom's maiden name. Seaborn was like one of his grandpa's. Good southern names of the family. And he's like, yeah, but we all go by silly little nicknames. That's how we do it in this Alp. His wife Peach, I was like, is that her given name? And her name's Margaret. And the nickname was actually because they started dating when she was living in Georgia and he was living in Texas, and they met when he was visiting one of his brothers in Georgia. And so his med school friends would call her like his Georgia Peach, and then that got shortened to G Peach, and then just Peach, and that's her nickname. And then again, another amazing line from Peach. She was like, later when she was contemplating divorce, she was like, I didn't mind the nickname at first, but now it's like both my first and last names were taken back from me when she married, and that's like, that's very sad. So anyway, a lot about him growing up. He was a military brat. He was a leash kid. Leash kids rise up. I was one myself. I could barely walk. My twin was really the leash kid, but twins, you know, you can't treat them different. So I also had a leash. But anyway, there's lots of stuff about moving around to different military bases, mainly in like the southeastern United States, but then also, of course, going abroad. His first memories are in Japan. There was a time where they were in Saudi Arabia. He always mentions when they were abroad, he's like, my mom loved the cheap domestics. When they were in Japan, they're like, and one of them, we didn't even need to pay. Like the others, it would be like, we paid her $8 a month and some food. One of them we didn't need to pay because she was part of war reparations. And I was like, oh wow, oh wow, oh wow, Beck. Again, I won't come for him. And he was like a literal baby. He talks about how his dad only met his grandfather on one occasion. He was placed on a train across Georgia to go to a meeting of Confederate Civil War veterans, and my great-grandfather, I'm told, was resplendent in his Confederate uniform that day. I'm reminded that in the South, Memorial Day was once celebrated as Confederate Veterans Day, and the Civil War was known as the War of Northern Aggression. And then he just jumps onto something else. And it's just, there's all these like wacky, wild anecdotes with like no analysis, no segue. I was getting whiplash. It was quite silly. Like, there's so many anecdotes in here like this, but this is a good example one where he started high school near Wichita Falls as a sophomore in the autumn of '61. Education was an afterthought there, the kind of place where they held an annual junior-senior fight. They actually had an organized fist fight, which held little appeal for a 5'8", 127-pound bruiser such as myself. I stayed home on junior-senior fight day. Despite my size, however, I didn't get picked on too much as a kid. I was clever enough to realize when Tharg should be left alone. I don't know what Tharg is. Anyway, besides, I'm a bleeder. I didn't see any merit in getting the bejeebers beat out of me by going toe-to-toe with someone 75 pounds heavier than I. It's like, he literally said bejeebers. I'm obsessed. Yeah, then he starts to get depressed in college. Then he started getting suicidal, and he just kind of like ignores it and pushes through. He's like, sometimes I just need to lie down for a few hours, you know. Read the suicidal thoughts. He's like, you know, when they happened, like, they passed eventually, but at that point I'd kind of like made peace with myself that, like, barring an accident or something like that, I would probably take my own life. That's how I would die. You know, and he would just like pepper that in and then be like, so anyway, I didn't want the bejeebers beaten out of me at the high school fist fights. Peach talks about her own childhood too, family history. Her dad died from radiation poisoning. I think he worked in some experimental lab thing where you get radiation poisoning. And so her mom was like a single mom, but then had her mother-in-law, whose husband had recently died, like move in with them. So they were kind of like the two parents of the household, but then also so was her older brother Howie. And she's like, yes, I was loved and blah blah blah. But she's like, I think children need two parents. And it's like, what are you supposed to do when your dad dies of radiation poisoning? Like, there's just instances where you can't have two parents and you've had 2 or 3 parental figures. And she's like, I just felt like my upbringing was incomplete. And I mean, Peach is an icon and I love her. But yeah, that one gave me the... She said that upbringing put some starch in her spine, though. Like, I love how they talk. I'm so enamored. Oh, then it talks about them getting married. She had moved from her Georgia town to Dallas or Houston. I think it was Dallas, where he was doing his med school. But she was like, I wanted to get out of my town anyway, and I guess like we were seeing each other. And she's like, I kept my own address. That's just the type of girl I am. But then Beck was starting a residency in Boston, and she said, I'm not moving to Boston unless some decisions are made. So that gave him the push to propose. He's like, I don't know if I would have done it otherwise. We would have just like lived in Georgia, but you know, she's not that type of girl. So they got married. Peach said, there was no engagement ring, which really didn't bother me. I used my grandmother's ring for my wedding ring, and I purchased Beck's for him at a discount jeweler's in Dallas. If I hadn't been so in love, I would have realized that the $1,200 worth of camera equipment he just bought himself would have bought a nice little diamond. So yeah, it does kind of seem like this is inklings of Beck's pattern of really throwing himself into his hobbies and interests and things like that, and not necessarily keeping that same energy for his family and relationships. Which, you know, some people just like are like that, but Peach is not like that. They were a little uncompatible on that front. Oh yeah, then they moved to Boston and it's a little miserable. They like Boston, they like everything, but Beck is always doing school stuff or work stuff, and not being very present, and Peach couldn't really get a job up there because there's a lot of similar type of couples where like husband's in town for like science work, med stuff, and wife has a degree in like teaching, and so all the teaching jobs are like taken. They're like, if she got a job and with the commute and like all that, it would just be a wash, excuse me. So she's like, I earned my keep like other ways, helped him like develop his library, like doing like other things, like keeping the household, of course. But she's like, I was going a little crazy, and she's like, I decided I want a baby. So they didn't really talk about it. Like, she decided on her own that they would. I didn't actually stop taking the pill, as Beck had suspected, but I did sort of play Russian roulette. The result was our son Beck, who was born in October 1978. So yeah, I am a little questionable, but I'm also just like, that's iconic. I fear I'm obsessed with her. Yeah, so their son is Beck the second, I think legally, but Beck, his name's Seaborn. His middle name is Beck, but I think they just named the son Beck. I don't know if he was Seaborn Beck. It's not specified, but they don't even call him that. They call him Bub. I'm obsessed. This is so goofy. There's like a good like 4 pages about lore about their family pets. There's this cat Muffin, who was apparently improperly named. Vlad the Impaler was more like it. She was very hoity-toity. She traveled by limousine and drank saucers of champagne and was always drunk. She moved in circles Peach and I only dreamed of. You know, unlike calling up your bestie George W. Bush on the private line. Anyway, then they would have Baby, the next cat, who was perhaps even more intense and brutal than Muffin. But then they had a dog named Missy. One day Meg put Missy on a leash to go show her off to the people across the street. Unfortunately for Missy, the family owned a huge Rottweiler named Hannah, who blew through a chain link fence, took Missy in her teeth, and tore the poor little dog 5 ways from Sunday, with Meg still hanging on to her leash. It was astonishing that Missy was not killed. I find that like so, well, I mean, I'm not happy that Missy was gored. She did survive, but she did look, they said, like the Bride of Frankenstein afterwards. Oh, and then also after her surgery, when she got home, she was just like in pain, shaking, and so Beck was like, I slept on the kitchen floor with her while she recovered, and then they bonded. So Missy was like the closest creature in his family to him because they bonded after her surgery. Like, I love little stories like this. I thought it was like so fun, having a grand old time, but I don't necessarily think that this book is great. Plus, also, I understand why people might not like what they're getting into. Then there's just a lot of like the marital troubles, issues with the climbing. He talks a lot about some of his other climbing experience he had before attempting Everest, because he was on the 7 summit quest. He hadn't done them all, but he'd done some. So yeah, there was climbs about that. He's also allegedly afraid of heights, so he really does have a death wish, if you're, at least at that time. Oh, so yeah, there's more marital stuff coming to a head, more his depression stuff coming to a head. He tries to tell Peach about it, and he's like, I don't remember it going that way. But according to her, he was like, I'm depressed and it's your fault and it's our marriage. And she's like, how dare you? How dare you? And it's true, how dare he? He ends up going to a psychiatrist, and he's like, I don't really believe in those. I don't trust their literature, their scientific stuff. There's not proof. How can you just talk about things? And he's like, so yeah, I went and I talked about wanting to kill myself. And yes, I had a great uncle and a cousin kill themselves too. But like, what does that have to do with me? They had reasons for it. My cousin had juvenile diabetes. So it's like, wow, yeah, you might as well be dead, I guess. And then he said his great uncle was concerned about being a burden. So he was like, so yeah, he just gave his gun to my dad to clean, and then he went and shot himself. I don't see what's so strange about that. So yeah, then Beck tells Peach that the therapist wants to speak with her. Peach said that Beck was like, it is because everything's our marriage's fault. But then she goes to the therapist and he's like, you need to get rid of all of your guns. Stat. Like, because they're a Texan couple, and apparently Peach was not thrilled about them, but they did have guns. I will read the list now. There was a shotgun, a .22 rifle, a .38 revolver, a .357 Magnum, a .22 pistol, and a little Derringer, and a pellet gun. They all went to the police, including the pellet gun, which I'd never quite thought of in that context. So again, it was just, I had a ball reading this. But even like, I think it flit around a lot from like serious topics, but still like, I don't know. I'm a jokester too. I love to laugh. I had a good time. Yeah, I'm sorry, this review is mainly just me reading some of my favorite anecdotes, but they're really funny. So he did one climb in Russia, Mount Elbrus. They're at the customary post-climb celebration. It was held in Moscow in a huge room that looked like the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles. There was a big table right in the center, sumptuously laden with food, Russian champagne, pitchers of vodka, white and black caviar. It was an incredible meal. There were other little tables around their main table, and he had assumed they were for other patrons. Sure enough, people did start coming in, most of them pairs of young women who sat down and ordered aperitifs. I thought, how nice! Muscovites out on the town. Then I realized that all of the tables had 2 young women each. Our big table began to disperse as various guys went to sit down with these gals. Slow as I am, I finally did figure out that there was a second course to that meal. Intercourse. They were all working girls. No way was Spotless McFarland here going to hook up with one of these war brides, only to be taken aside and rubber truncheoned by the KGB. But evidently, such fears did not dissuade every member of our group. When I got back to our hotel, my roommate was missing in action. Like, that's just so fucking funny. I'm sorry. Like, just so corny. Yeah, corny. This book is corny, and I had a ball. I also think that it is is quite experimental in how it's laid out, because things were paced all over the place, and with the transcripts, like there'd be back and forthing, especially between Beck and Peach, where Peach was like, and then he blamed me for his depression, and then it would cut to Beck and he's like, that's not true, and then back to Peach. And so it's like, I loved that it really like played with that. It felt like just listening to conversations. I still don't really think this was like a great book. I think there could have been more finessing in structure and maybe cutting out some glut, although I did like the glut. It wasn't my favorite thing ever, of course, but it was really, I can't say it enough. I enjoyed my time. Yeah, there's like one part where they spend 1, 2, 3, a little more than 3 pages on like his packing list for a different climb, like climbing a different mountain that wasn't Everest. And I'm like, do we need to read 3 pages of your climbing list? The only thing in there that like wasn't, like for his head, he said a fool's hat. That was my innovation. I figured that if you're gonna act like a fool, you might as well look like one. Oh, sorry for only sporadically doing my horrible country accent. I can't commit to the bit enough to do it the entire time I read things. Anyway, so yeah, almost just like an unadulterated packing list. Was he on page count or what? But there is just also so much you could talk about. Like, it was a confusing text. I'm gonna choose to believe it was experimental. We get to the final part, and it's like, parts 2 and 3 are a little bit more before Everest. Part 2, I think, is more kind of like early childhood, early adulthood. Part 3 is more like settled adulthood once they were all in Dallas, and then his start of mountaineering. Then part 3 is like post-Everest. And there's still like, the timeline is very squiggly. Part 4 is mainly post-Everest. And so at this point, I'm wondering, what's this family death? They talked about Baby the cat dying, but that was in 98. And it was Peach's brother, Howie. And it was very sad because every time Howie showed up prior in this book, everyone's just like, he was just so great. I don't think it was just people refusing to say anything bad about the dead. He did actually just kind of seem like a really chill guy. He was very smart, had a good career, so that gives you a lot of stability and stuff. But he kind of stepped up, not only as a proto-dad to Peach because of their dad dying, but also to the children, Bub and Meg, because Beck was very distant and gone. And sometimes, like, when they would do family vacations, he'd be like off climbing, hiking and whatever, and then he'd come back and be exhausted. Yeah, Howie, he was in Georgia and they were in Texas, but he'd come out for like the kid recitals and shows, and he went to like Bub's show and tell once. He was like always doing things, just like constantly being there for maybe like smaller ticket sort of events. And then also they vacationed a lot together, Howie's family and then the Weathers family minus Beck, when it would be like he was out doing his mountaineering trip. So the kids were close with Howie. It was very sad when he died, beyond just like it always being sad when someone died. But then Beck was kind of in one of the first steps of him showing that he's a changed man and back with those good old-fashioned family values. He was being there for Peach, very involved in trying to coordinate medical care for his cancer. Apparently they did not like one of the hospitals he was in. They didn't feel it was responsive enough, so there was a lot of, he was calling to yell at them, which I don't like calling to yell at people, but also it's like, you know, it's important, your medical care. Yeah, he's like, in the past I would have been like very sad because he liked Howie, everyone liked Howie, but he would have like left things for Peach to deal with. But now he's like, no, now I was involved. And so that was nice. Again, this book is all over the place. So is this video. I mainly just like read from it. In the beginning, especially part 1, when it's like strictly about Everest, you more so get the vibe that he is an inspirational speaker. You can book him for a lecture. But then I guess all of that family stuff isn't necessarily stuff that would come up in his talks as much. So that felt a little less polished through the lens of inspirational speech. But then there was an epilogue where I was like, oh, yeah, we're back. He talks about like spirituality and like, I now understand that humans are the toughest creatures on earth. There's a reason we're at the top of the food chain, and it's not simply because we're a smarter cockroach. There's a drive, determination, and strength within each of us. Most of us never have to tap into those reserves. We live pretty easy lives, which, in contrast to the pioneers who settled the wilderness and explored far places. And shockingly, this book ends not with words from Peach, not with words from Beck, but from a family friend, Pat White, who said, Beck's just a very fine person. He cares about people, however inadequately he expresses it. He's been wounded in his personal life, but he's still an acute observer. He translates that into humor. Whatever the difficulties, there's great love there. They said Madame had a brave heart. Well, Beck has a great heart, and Peach is very brave in her own way too. She didn't kill him, which she would have been within every right. If it were me, there would have been an episode of Snapped. Maybe, not really. Oh, again, also sorry, because this book is so sporadic. They do also talk in part 4 a lot about his surgeries, because at first they thought that there was going to be more parts of his hands that would be able to be salvaged, but then it was just like the tissue was just all straight up dead, so they needed to do like more amputation than was even necessarily initially thought. There was a lot of things falling off him and lots of skin being taken from things. He said the only part of his body that remained untouched was his right thigh, and he's like, that scares me. What are they saving it for? One of the things that fell off was his nose. Before it fell off, they made a little mold of it, so when he got his new nose, it was his old nose. When they got his nose back, they needed to regrow it like upside down on his forehead for something to like get nerve endings, and then they take it from there and they put it there. And he was like, I had to be careful to make sure the kids didn't take pictures of me lest they sell them to the National Enquirer. And then he was also like, it helps me know who my real friends were. They fell down on their keisters laughing at me. Everyone else was just polite. That's like the tone of the book. That's the vibe. That's Beck in a nutshell. He talks about his reconstructive plastic surgeon, Greg Anigan. Reconstructive plastic surgeons, dirty plastic surgeons in hospital parlance, are very different from their colleagues who specialize in cosmetic plastic surgery. They are not vanity engineers. What they do is big time stuff, and they tend to be fantastic at it. The better ones can sew a fart to a moonbeam. I'd put Greg among them, even if he is an Aggie from Texas A&M. So yeah, he went through a lot. He might have lost a lot of skin and extremities, but he did not lose his sense of humor. And then he regained his relationship with his family. He said in that epilogue, people will ask him if he would do it again, and he thinks, what a stupid question. But he's like, no, there's a deeper question to be asked. And he's like, yes, I would, because it helped him be the dad who stepped up instead of Howie, his brother-in-law. So yeah, that was Left for Dead. Again, it was all over the place. Hopefully I can edit this into something good. Again, I had a fun time, but I don't think this was an especially good book, craft-wise, but you know, it had a lot of fun anecdotes and it didn't take itself too seriously. I don't know if I would recommend it. You'd have to be in the mood to like hear stories about like them making up lore about their cats. I would not recommend it. I definitely liked it better than Into Thin Air, which I guess should be a bar for this. I liked The Climb more, I guess. I didn't have as much fun reading this. This is the book that I had the most fun reading so far, except for maybe the children's Choose Your Own Adventure. But the fact that this is up there with the children's Choose Your Own Adventure speaks volumes. So yeah.